This is a true account of Rex Pattison's life as a young lad living in Deal during the 1940s and 1950s. It gives the young lad's recollections of how Deal was in those days, and is read as Rex has written it out. Rex now lives in Canada. After the war, we moved to my father's hometown of Deal on the Kent coast. It is the town which Charles Dickens featured in his novel Bleak House. His character, Esther Summerson, describes Deal thus: "At last we came to the narrow streets of Deal, and very gloomy they were upon a raw misty morning. The long flat beach with its little irregular houses, wooden and brick, and its litter of capstans, and great boats and sheds, and bare upright poles with tackle and blocks, and loose gravelly waste places overgrown with grass and weeds, wore as dull an appearance as any place I ever saw." Dickens wrote that some 100 years before our arrival, but apart from horse-drawn carriages being replaced by motor cars and the stagecoaches supplanted by the steam train, I suspect little had changed. The fishing boats, capstan and winches are very much part of my memory. I don't know how many generations of Pattisons came from the Deal area, but the spelling of our surname suggests a Germanic origin. Later in life my father attended a conference in Brussels and got friendly with a man from Denmark. My father must have mentioned his Norse ancestry, because a few days after his return he received a postcard with a picture of a man dressed as a Viking astride a bicycle. On the back of the card was the simple message, "We found him, your dad." However, since that part of Kent was invaded in the 4th century, not by Vikings but by Jutes, that could be well the origins of our family. Anyway, I'm not sure. There are pictures of Jutes on bikes. I guess they were not as sexy as the Vikings. Deal is on a stretch of coast north of Dover, just about where the English Channel meets the North Sea. It is unusual in that once it served as a port despite not having a harbour. That is because of a huge sandbar offshore known as the Goodwin Sands, which lie mostly underwater but are exposed enough at very low tides to provide the venue for an annual cricket match. In Charles Dickens' time, ships would anchor in the lee of the sands and unload cargo and passengers onto local rowboats to be brought ashore. Being at the north end of the English Channel, the sands also presented a major hazard to shipping, and over 2,000 wrecks have been recorded in that area. The local boatmen therefore did a smart trade in salvage, which also lent itself to a thriving smuggling operation. Given also to nearby coal mines and Royal Marine barracks, Deal deserved its pretty rough reputation in Victoria times. We lived over a shop on Queen Street, just down from the railway station and just a short rise to the beach. The beach is a steeply shelving bank of shingle, which in those days was still dominated by the sturdy rowboats that the fishermen used to catch mackerel, herring, cod and other fish, which they sold on the shore. The boats were heavy clinker-built vessels that were hauled up the beach using winches. The winches and cables gave off grease, which coupled globs of tar that floated in the tide. This provided a hazard to clean clothing, and that seemed to be a magnet for a small boy. If there was any joy in sitting on the uncomfortable pebbles, it was negated by being chastised for getting stains on my pants. There was no sand to build castles with, and a chill wind seemed to blow even on sunny days. I do not recall life in Deal as a particularly happy time. I suffered from chronic asthma, which not only curtailed my schooling, but meant that I spent many hours hunched over a bowl containing a mixture of boiling water and stuff called Friar's Balsam to ease my breathing. The idea was to create a miniature sweat lodge containing a noxious brew which one inhaled. This was no fun, but I must admit it did the job. I attended the local convent school, but I don't remember it at all. I spent much of my time looking out on the street through our bay window. In this immediate post-war, we still had rationing. I recall going with my mother to the grocery store across the road, By & Sons, where in exchange for a coupon, a small amount of sugar would be carefully weighed out and poured into a blue paper bag. My mother was still young and beautiful, and a flutter of her eyes would sometimes get her a little extra something. Queen Street led to the train station, and having our window overlooking it was a bonus. There was always a steady stream of traffic coming and going, including a beautiful steam-powered lorry, strikingly painted bright green and red. With the war ended and petrol rationing over, the steam-driven lorry was soon a thing of the past. but the trains were still powered by steam locomotives, which oozed a sense of power and might. There were different classes of locomotive, ranging from the smaller shunting engines for local work to the magnificent giants that powered the express passenger trains at high speed. I have a clear memory of walking up Queen Street. I crossed the railway track and turned left into Mill Road. There was Victoria Park, dissected by a road which led to a bridge under the railway tracks. I continued along Mill Road until I found an alley on the west side of the road. At the end of the alley was Lees Road, and there, to the left, was my grandparents' house, which I was able to identify as number 15. The house does not seem to have changed. My treat was to accompany my grandfather into the garden shed where he prepared food for the chicken. Lawns were turned into vegetable plots and livestock pens during the war. My eyes were about the same level as his workbench, so I had a close-up view of the bran and whatever else he threw into the mix, which he turned into a sort of granola for hens. Whatever he put in there seemed to work, and I was allowed to hunt for eggs while the chicken gave their attention to their meal. What I remember most is the smell, a sort of warm branny aroma that I recall with fondness today. I have the impression that my grandmother, Ellen, didn't particularly like children, but my grandfather Fred was always kind and took me under his wing. Like everyone else in those days, he spoke with a distinct local twang. He had an East Kent accent, which identified him as a man of Kent, as opposed to a Kentish man from west of the River Rochester. If you really wanted to hear strong local accents, it came in the form of the sing-song cries of the local street vendors. Their calls could be heard from streets away to let the housewives know that they were in the vicinity. Each vendor would push his handcart, which was loaded with fish or vegetables. I remember we also had a rag and bone man who would collect junk, who said recycling is new. On our way home from my grandparents, we would usually stop at Victoria Park, which had a play area with swings, a roundabout and a long rocking horse. One time there were some kids on the rocking horse, so I got behind to push it. I'm not sure what happened next, but the back of the horse came down on my left knee and nearly split it open. There wasn't much blood, and I remember seeing a glimpse of a shining white bone protruding through the skin. I can't remember the pain I had, but my quick-thinking mother threw me into somebody's pram and ran us up the road to the hospital, which was only stone's throw away. Before I knew it, I was on my back in an operating theatre. That was okay until they put a mask over my face and dropped chloroform on it and put me under. It was the most horrible, suffocating sensation, and I could hear a loud singing in my ears before I passed out. I don't remember much after that, but 70 years on, I still have a 5 centimetre scar on my left leg, which is curved to give me the only smiling knee I know of. Travelling south of Deal a short distance, you come to Walmer. There was a plaque on the beach here claiming that this is where Julius Caesar landed to conquer England for the Romans, and where he was supposed to utter the famous phrase, Veni, Vidi, Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. Sadly, recent research suggests his landing point was further north, and this utterance was from another war. I hate it when archaeologists destroy good myths. What is not disputed is that both Deal and Walmer have coastal defence forts built by Henry VIII. Walmer had a garrison barracks going back to the time of Dickens. In the 1950s, this was occupied by the Royal Marine School of Music. Once a year, the graduates would march from the barracks along the seafront and down our street to the railway station, where they embarked to whatever they were assigned. To this day, the sight of the Royal Marine Band in their blue uniform and distinctive white helmets and gloves still brings a lump to my throat. My mother's friend had a house on a Georgian terrace overlooking the Royal Marines parade ground. The friend had a parrot who watched the drum major put the band through its paces day after day. The story goes that one day the parrot yelled out, "Dismiss!" in the RSM's voice, and all the troops came smartly to attention and then walked off the parade ground. Pretty well on the dividing line between Deal and Walmer was the Royal National Lifeboat Station. Unlike the US Coast Guard we have here, the RNLI boats have a single task: search and rescue. They are small boats, but over 200 are stationed around Britain's shores, manned by mainly volunteer crews. Being opposite the Goodwin Sands, the Walmer lifeboat was once one of the busiest, and when the siren sounded to call the crew to action, my father would sometimes take me down to watch the launch. The crew would get into the boat, which was poised on a steep ramp. When ready, the restraints would be removed and the boat would rush down the slope, and with its crew hanging on for dear life, it entered the sea with a dramatic splash. On one occasion we went down during a gale and saw the boat return. There was a hush as they gently unloaded the body of one of the crew. The following citation is in the RNLI records in 1950. The bellman of the Warmer lifeboat, James Rich, collapsed and died in the lifeboat when he went out on the 24th of December to help the Italian steamer Santa Gata and rescued her crew of 32. The institution granted a pension to his widow. This was the first time I had seen a dead body. I was aged 9 and it introduced me to the concept of mortality. Our family car was a Morris 8 with huge external headlights, no heating and had to be started using a crank handle. I remember journeys in the winter huddled under a blanket as we rattled along at 40 or 50 miles an hour. The turn indicators were orange arms that flicked up from the bodywork, the height of sophistication. My father was an electrical engineer and had served in the sappers in the war. He was not a practical man. The apartment we lived in had a small rooftop balcony which my mother suggested needed sprucing up. My father bought a tin of whitewash, about the only paint you could buy in those days, and borrowed a stepladder. What followed was one of those Kodak moments where you wish you had a camera. He went up the ladder, took one step too many and rapidly descended down to the other side, landing in a sitting position, covered in whitewash. Of course, he could have been badly injured. Mother and I were doubled up with laughter and incapable of helping. Never one to be held back by his limitations, my father decided that I should learn how to make a fire. Maybe he had inside knowledge of impending power cuts, who knows. So we set off into the countryside to a field where the wheat had recently been harvested. It was a hot, dry, late summer day, but with enough breeze to make it pleasant. We made a circle of stones to contain the fire and gathered twigs from the adjacent hedgerows, using some dry straw for kindling. I was given the honour of lighting the match. Everything was so dry that the fire took immediately. In fact, it exceeded its expectations, as the timely gust of wind fanned it into a raging inferno, blowing sparks over our carefully constructed barrier and setting the stubble in the field alight. Father rushed to the nearby hedge and wrenched a branch off and started beating the flames out, which were now spreading rapidly. It was, however, too late and the fire took on a life of its own. There was only one thing for it. We returned to the car and took off. There was a cafe down the road where my father made a call to the fire department. We stayed in the cafe to have a much needed cup of tea. As we did so, there was a clanging of a bell and the local fire engine rushed by. I was just about to inquire if they were going to our fire when my mother clamped her hand over my mouth. The instant of the fire did not dampen my father's determination to teach me survival skills. In those days, each town had a store which sold army surplus items. These would range from billy cans to a 12-man tent. No guns though. Father purchased a 2-man tent complete with guy ropes, pegs, a large wooden mallet to bash in the pegs and poles. Again we set off for a nearby field. This time I was allowed to bring my friend Barry. Father showed us how to lay the heavy canvas flat on the ground. We then assembled the poles, which one at each end would give the tent height. Now the trick was to provide the whole structure with stability, using the guy ropes secured to the ground with tent pegs. Barry was assigned to go inside the tent and hold one of the poles upright, while I fixed the guy ropes by bashing the pegs into the ground with a mallet. We had more or less done this at the open end of the tent, and Barry was instructed to erect the pole at the other end. I now repeated my trick with the rear guy ropes. Suddenly there was an unseemly bulge on the side of the tent, so I hit it with my mallet. Unfortunately, the bulge was Barry's head. There was a muffled cry and the tent collapsed. When we extracted Barry from the ruins of the tent, he was covered in blood with a gash on his skull, so we bundled him into the car and rushed him to the local hospital. We later delivered a bandaged Barry with 3 stitches back to his parents. I had a distinct impression they were not too pleased, and I have no recollection of playing with Barry after that. Somewhere along the line I was presented with a gramophone. It came in a smart blue carrying case complete with a winding handle and one 48 RPM record. I'm sure my mother was given the record because it was quite unsuitable for a child of only 9. In those days, a gramophone record carried just 2 songs, one on each side. On one side was Ghost Riders in the Sky, and on the other was The Last Roundup. The latter was about a dying cowboy, and the former was about the sort of hell they were headed for. They were both sung in a sort of woeful wail that was the vogue for the cowboy songs that were all the craze at the time. To play the record, you put a new needle in the pickup. The needles came in a metal tin, like a pillbox, and only lasted a couple of plays. Then you placed the crank handle in a hole on the side of the machine and wound up the spring that powered the turntable. Now you were ready to play. Not only were the tunes and lyrics utterly depressing, but as the spring wound down, they become even more so. I was most probably the most morose kid on the block. While looking for photos to illustrate this part of my life, I came across a shot of Dill Beach as it was in the 1950s. I wrote to the provider of the photo, listed as David Scarden, and found a new friend. David comes from a long line of boatmen who earned a living fishing off of Dill Beach, and would have been in Dill at the time I was there. Who knows, we might have crossed paths in the playground. Thanks for listening to part of my childhood days as I grew up in Dill. The happy days, those long ago years, when Dill was a thriving community of boats and boatmen. The old characters and boats can never be removed from my memories of those long ago years.